Story time about how I crashed my dad's really expensive car. So a little background information. My mom had just got remarried to my stepdad 3 years ago, and he was this rich asshole who owned a bunch of food trucks and thought he was the shit. Well, at the time I also had a boyfriend, and we had only been dating for like a month and a half. But my boyfriend would always beg me to let him drive my stepdad's car, and I always said no because that was like his child. Like, he had children. He could care less about them. His car was more important. Anyway, so the one weekend my parents are out of town, and one of my friends was throwing a graduation party. So that whole day my boyfriend was trying to talk me into taking the car, and I already knew where my stepdad hid the keys. So I just decided I wouldn't drink that night and I would just take the car. He kept asking me if he could drive, but clearly I said no, because this kid literally told me that he crashed the first 2 cars that he had. So we get to the party, we're having a good time, and one of my friends tells me that everybody's taking pictures with my car outside. Like for part 2. Part 2 about how I crashed my dad's very expensive car. So like I said, everybody's taking pictures of the car, but I decided to let it go at first. I mean, there was one point where I went outside just so that way I could kind of let everybody know, hey, you're taking pictures with my car. Well, half an hour later, my boyfriend and I decided to leave, and he's obliterated. Like, we probably got 50 feet from her house, and then I had to stop the car so that way he could get out and throw up in somebody's yard. Anyway, so he gets in the car, we're on the way back to my house, and my house was like a 20-minute drive away. Well, we were 5 minutes from my house. At this one intersection, I get a green light and I go to make a right, and I accidentally hit a car turning out of the bar parking lot. So I'm literally freaking the fuck out. And my boyfriend's in the seat next to me crying for some reason. So the guy in the other car calls the cops. The cops show up, they call my stepdad and my mom. My boyfriend went to the hospital, he had alcohol poisoning. Well, my boyfriend told his mom that it was all my fault and I'm grounded for 6 months.
When I was 24, me and my sister moved into an apartment together. At the time, I was going to college to get my master's, and she was going in to get her degree. The rent was $500 a month. I know, cheap. We only paid $250 each. But the neighborhood was bad. There was a lot of crackhead, gangs. There was a shooting just about every week. I know, just crazy. Anyways, one day in the middle of the night, we get a hard banging on our door, and it's a lady calling out for help. When I opened it, she had a black eye, she was bruised up, and her forehead was bleeding. I asked what's going on, and she replied her boyfriend is trying to kick her and her kids out of their place. She explained she has a 1-year-old and a 5-year-old, and her boyfriend is throwing all of their things out. So I walked over back to her apartment, which was 2 floors down. When we finally reached the apartment, the whole apartment was on fire. She screamed and said her babies were in there. Come back for part 2. This is part 2 of how my neighbor's boyfriend set her apartment on fire with her children inside. If you didn't watch part 1, go watch that so you can understand this part. So, like I said, the apartment was on fire and she was screaming about her kids, and she tried to run in and get her kids, but I stopped her because there was no way she and her kids were going to make it out alive. Few seconds later, her boyfriend walks up and says, "Let her go." And she runs over to him and swings on him a couple times and says, "What did you do? Get them out." And he replied, "I told you to leave, right?" She falls to her knees, and at that point, she just stops crying. So I run upstairs calling for help, telling everyone to get out and call the fire department. The fire starts to quickly spread, and everyone is coming out of their apartments. When I went back to the area where the lady was, her boyfriend disappeared, and I picked her up from off the ground. I brung her into the parking lot where everyone else was. After 20 minutes, the fire department finally shows up. Come back for part 3. This is part 3 of how my neighbor's boyfriend set her apartment on fire with her children inside. So, like I said, the fire department finally shows up after 20 minutes. I told them there were kids inside, and they went up to find them. They put the fire out. Right after, a firefighter came up to me and said there was no one in there, and I told him no, there were 2 kids. A couple minutes later, a few detectives and cops came up to me and asked me a few questions about the scene, asking things like if I know who started it and about my neighbors. A couple minutes later, there was an old man, which I found out was one of my neighbors. He came from the side of the apartment complex screaming that there was a little boy on his back, lying on the ground, saying that he couldn't move. So quickly, the detectives go over to where my neighbor said the boy was. I'm running out of time. Part 4 will be up soon. This is part 4 of how my neighbor's boyfriend set her apartment on fire with her children inside. After one of my neighbors claimed they saw a little boy on the ground in the back of the apartment complex, and the boy's arm was pillows wrapped up in a comforter. When the detective got the paramedics to pick the boy up, they took the comforter he had and they opened it, and inside was a baby. After the whole situation was over, they took me in for questioning. Also, by the way, they admitted the lady into the hospital as well because she was bruised up really bad, and anytime anyone asked her anything, she was mute. During my time in the police station, they told me about the little boy. Come to find out, that little boy on the ground in back of the apartment complex was her son. They said he wrapped his baby sister up to protect her from getting hurt. Baby girl was fine. The pillows he wrapped her in softened her fall. But for the little boy, he was paralyzed from...
Story time about the old man that died in our basement. At the time, my mom was a CNA and she would do at-home care. One of the people that she took care of was one of her best friend's uncles. She would drop him off Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. He was in the 70s, he had arthritis, and was bedridden. So my mom would feed him, clean him, and change his diapers. But he was so mean. He didn't like me or my brothers and sisters. Just a little old grumpy man. But my mom would keep all her patients in the basement. By the way, which didn't look like a basement. It looked really nice, almost like a hospital type. So one day my mom needed to leave the house to go get food for the man. And she told me to watch out for her and call her if anything ever happened. So I went down there and he just stared at me the whole time. I said hello and he rolled his eyes. Couple hours pass, I'm scrolling on my phone, and his heart starts beating really fast. He looked like he was trying to cough and was reaching out for me. Everything happened so fast, I was in shock and I didn't know what to do, and he grabbed my arm.
When I was 6 years old, my family moved to Virginia because my dad had a new job opportunity. We moved to this really old house that every step that you took, you'd hear the floorboards cracking. During the summer, I met this girl named Lucy. She knocked on my door one day and asked if I wanted to play, so for weeks, me and Lucy grew closer. We'd play hopscotch, jump rope, hand games, and hide and seek. One day, we were getting ready to play hopscotch, and my mom came outside telling me to come in and eat dinner. I asked my mom if Lucy could come too. My mom had asked, "Who's Lucy?" I looked back at Lucy and I said, "She's right here." My mom replied, "Right where?" When I turned back around, Lucy disappears. I called out for Lucy, but my mom yells out, "There isn't anyone out there. Get your butt in the house. It's time to come eat." It gets a little bit paranormal after this incident, but come back for part 2 if you want to know why Lucy disappeared. When I was younger, there was a girl I knew who lived in our neighborhood. None of the kids liked her because they claimed that she stank and acted weird. When they talked about her, I kind of felt bad, so I became friends with her. Yeah, of course, I got the "why do you hang out with her?" But she really wasn't all that bad. But her scent, they were kind of right about that. One day, she invites me over to her house, and she was very excited because she told me I was the first person to ever come over. And I felt so honored, so I went. But when I went into her house, it smelled very bad, almost nauseating, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be rude. She had a lot of uncles that lived with her family. Honestly, it was like 4 to 5 families in one house, to be honest. But she first introduced me to her stepmom. I said hi to her, but she just stared at me in disgust. Then we went to her room to play. As it got later, I told her I needed to go home. But she begged me to stay longer because she was scared. I told her I'd come tomorrow, and she just starts crying. She runs into her bed and falls into her sheets, which lifted her skirt. There were bruises all over her thighs. Let me know if y'all want a part 2. Part 2 about the girl I know who lived in my neighborhood. So it's late and it's time for me to go home. She said she was scared and starts crying. Then she runs into her bed and flops into her sheets. Her skirt lifted and there were bruises all around her thighs. I asked her what happened. She looks down and quickly pulls her skirt over her bruises. I asked, "Did someone do that to you?" And she says she can't tell me. I asked why. She responds, "If I do, they're going to hurt me." So I ran downstairs to her stepmom and told her what I saw. She sits and laughs in my face. I was so confused and asked her, "Are you going to help her?" And she tells me that little hoe can help herself and that I actually should be going home. So I went into the living room where her uncles were and told them. One of them had said, "That's why that girl don't need to be bringing random folks into the house," and runs upstairs to her room. One of the other uncles asks, "You want to get popped?" I shook my head in fear and said no. And he yells at me, telling me to go home. From there, I ran home and never came back. And after that day, she never came back outside. It's been 7 years. To this day, I wonder what happened to her.